Winter in the boreal forest does not arrive. It occupies. It moves through the trees like something with intention, filling every space between the branches, pressing against the walls of every shelter, finding every gap in every barrier a community has raised against it. The cold of the northern forest in the depths of January is not a temperature. It is a presence, a weight, something that must be negotiated with, accommodated, survived. For the Algonquin, the Cree, the Ojibwe, and the many related peoples who have lived in these forests for thousands of years, winter was never simply a season. It was a test, and, crucially, it was a communal test. The question winter asked was not whether you would survive. The question winter asked was whether you would allow the person beside you to survive as well, whether you would share what you had when you did not have enough, whether the cold would get inside you, not into your body, but into the place where your obligations to other people live. There is a name for what happens when a person fails that test completely, when hunger becomes the only reality, and the people who depend on you become merely an obstacle to that hunger. When the cold that matters is not the cold outside, but the cold that has begun, quietly, to form around the heart. Across Algonquian-speaking peoples, that name is the Wendigo. To understand the Wendigo, you must first understand the world that produced it, not from a comfortable distance, but from inside it. The Algonquian peoples were not a single nation, but a vast family of related communities speaking related languages across what is now northeastern North America and the Great Lakes region. Algonquin, Cree, Ojibwe, Innu, Abenaki, and many others. Their traditions share deep roots and many common elements, but they are not identical. The Wendigo is not one story told the same way everywhere. It is a family of stories, varying in its details and emphases from community to community, carrying a shared warning in different voices. That variation is part of its richness, and any account that flattens it into a single universal narrative has already missed something essential. What these communities shared was a world in which winter was the dominant organizing reality of life. The boreal forest, that vast belt of spruce, fir, birch, and pine stretching across the northern continent, offered extraordinary abundance in summer. Fish, game, berries, the full richness of the short growing season. Winter stripped all of that away. By midwinter, a small community, 20 people, perhaps 30, could be isolated by snow and cold for months at a time, dependent entirely on what had been cached and whatever game remained within reach. Food could run out. Hunting could fail. A season that lasted 1 week longer than expected could determine the difference between survival and catastrophe. In these conditions, the ethics of community were not philosophical abstractions. They were survival mechanisms. Sharing food, even inadequate food, even when you were hungry yourself, was not generosity as a virtue. It was the foundational agreement that made communal life possible. A person who hoarded provisions while others starved was not merely selfish. They were threatening the survival of everyone around them. They were choosing themselves over the community that kept everyone alive. And then there was the line beyond which no choice could return a person. Every community that preserved the Wendigo tradition knew what that line was. It was not metaphorical. It was the act of cannibalism, consuming human flesh, understood not as a crime to be adjudicated, but as a transformation, a crossing so profound in its violation that it did not simply change what a person had done. It changed what a person was. The Wendigo, spelled and pronounced differently across communities. Wendigo in many Ojibwe traditions, Witiko in some Cree accounts, is not, in the documented Indigenous tradition, primarily an external creature that descends on communities from the frozen dark. That version of the Wendigo belongs largely to horror fiction and popular entertainment, and it has very little to do with what these peoples actually believed and taught. The Wendigo, as documented in the ethnographic record and in the work of Indigenous scholars, among them Basil Johnston, an Ojibwe writer and cultural authority whose accounts of Ojibwe tradition are among the most reliable sources available, is a transformation, a process, something that happens to a human being from the inside out. A person approaching Wendigo transformation was described in various accounts as feeling a cold that came not from the air but from within, a freezing of the heart. The hunger that accompanied it was unlike ordinary hunger. It grew with feeding. It was not satisfied by consumption but enlarged by it. Some traditions describing the Wendigo as a being whose size always outpaced what it had eaten, forever larger than it should be, forever reaching beyond what any amount of feeding could fill. In some accounts, its eyes rolled in blood. In others, it was enormous and emaciated at once, a body that had become nothing but appetite. But the physical descriptions vary, and the documented tradition is less concerned with appearance than with nature. What the transformation destroyed was not the body, but the relational self, the part of a person that recognized other human beings as human, that felt obligation and love and communal responsibility. What replaced it was a hunger that had no room for any of those things. The Wendigo was not merely hungry, it was only hungry. Everything else that had been human about the person had been consumed by that hunger, quietly, from inside. To look across a winter fire and realize that the person looking back is no longer there, that was the terror. The great fear of these communities was not the supernatural creature in the dark. It was the person beside you, someone known, someone depended upon, crossing the line that could not be uncrossed and becoming something the community could no longer accommodate. The Wendigo lived in the community before it lived in the forest. The warning was specific and practical. Isolation was dangerous, not merely physically but morally and spiritually. A person facing starvation alone, cut off from their community, was vulnerable in ways that a person held within a network of mutual obligation was not. The story said, "Do not let people become isolated. Share what you have, even when you have very little." The conditions in which the Wendigo became possible were conditions that communities could prevent through their own behavior toward one another. And it carried a second, harder warning. If a community member crossed that line, if the signs of transformation became apparent, the community had an obligation to act. Scholars working with Algonquian communities in the 19th and early 20th centuries, including the anthropologist A. Irving Hallowell, who conducted extensive fieldwork with the Berens River Ojibwe, documented accounts of individuals exhibiting what later scholarship would call Wendigo psychosis, an overwhelming conviction that they were transforming into a Wendigo, sometimes accompanied by expressed desires to consume human flesh. The historical case record was later compiled systematically by Morton Tyker in his 1960 study of the phenomenon. In some documented instances, communities responded by killing the person in question, understood not as execution in any simple sense, but as a tragic necessity, the act of a community protecting itself while releasing a person from a transformation it believed had already begun. The historical record contains specific cases. In the brutal winter of 1878, a Cree man named Swift Runner, isolated from his community, crossed the line. He killed and consumed members of his own family. He was later tried and executed by Canadian colonial authorities. Whatever his state of mind, and he himself invoked Wendigo belief in his account, his is the story of a real man and a real family destroyed in the cold. Not a legend, a reckoning with exactly what the tradition had always warned about. Equally documented is the case of Jawuno Gijigo Gaubo, known in colonial records as Jack Fiddler, an Ojibwe leader recognized within his community for killing individuals believed to be in the process of Wendigo transformation. He and his brother were arrested by Canadian authorities in 1907. He died in colonial custody before any trial could proceed. His case represents a collision between a community's understanding of its own obligations and a colonial legal system that had no framework for comprehending what those obligations meant. The scholarly status of Wendigo psychosis, the proposed culture-bound syndrome of individuals becoming convinced they were transforming into Wendigos, is considerably more contested than the popular accounts suggest. In 1982, the anthropologist Lou Marano published a landmark paper in Current Anthropology making a forceful argument. Not that the syndrome had been exaggerated, but that it had never existed as a genuine clinical entity at all. Marano contended that anthropologists had constructed a psychiatric category from the outside in, that the executions recorded in the literature reflected community responses to starvation triage, fear, and social threat, and that the cultural framework of Wendigo transformation had been imposed by outside observers onto behavior that carried different meanings within the communities themselves. In his reading, the syndrome was not a discovery. It was an invention, produced by the very researchers who claimed to be documenting it. The debate has not been fully resolved. What it establishes clearly is that the relationship between the Wendigo tradition and the historical cases is far more complex than popular accounts suggest, and that this complexity is itself part of what the tradition reveals about the limits of understanding Indigenous cultural practice through a colonial lens. What does it reveal about a culture that its most feared being is not a monster approaching from outside, but a transformation of someone within? Most mythological traditions locate their great dangers at the edges of the human world. The threat arrives from beyond the boundary, and the community defends itself. The Wendigo moves in the opposite direction. It begins inside. It begins with a person the community knows and depends on. The horror is not the arrival of something alien. It is the departure of something familiar. That inversion carries the full ethical weight of the tradition. The Wendigo is the precise articulation of what these communities understood about the specific dangers of their world. Not the supernatural ones, but the human ones. The danger of isolated individuals who face impossible choices alone. The danger of a hunger so complete that it overrides every other human quality. The danger of a self so contracted around its own survival that it can no longer perceive the humanity of the people around it. The insatiable hunger at the center of the tradition is not simply appetite. It is the embodiment of a principle that consumption without limit is not merely destructive, it is transformative in the most irreversible sense. The Wendigo grows larger with what it consumes and is never satisfied. It is the logical end of choosing your own survival absolutely, without remainder, over the survival of everyone around you. A being constituted entirely by appetite, with nothing left of the relational self that makes a person part of something larger than themselves. Popular culture has not treated this tradition gently. Over more than a century, the Wendigo has been processed through horror fiction, film, and gaming into forms its original communities would barely recognize. Stripped of its communal context, given a visual identity that has no documented basis in any Algonquian tradition, reduced to a creature feature when it was always something far more demanding than that. What is lost in that processing is precisely what made the tradition remarkable. The communal ethic, the winter psychology, the understanding of how a person is held human by their obligations to others, and what it costs when those obligations are abandoned completely. That the tradition survived this and still carries its original warning recognizably at its core is itself a testimony to the depth of the knowledge these communities encoded in it. The Wendigo is still traveling. Stripped of its native context, it has been pressed into the shape of a conventional monster. But the original warning refuses to be entirely erased. Underneath everything that has been added to it, the architecture of the true tradition remains legible. The hunger that grows with feeding and is never satisfied, the cold that begins inside and works its way out, the transformation of someone known and loved into something the community can no longer accommodate. The question the tradition was always designed to answer: what does a people do when one of its own has chosen their survival so completely that nothing of their humanity remains? These communities answered that question with a story that encoded their deepest understanding of winter, of hunger, of mutual obligation, and of the specific human capacity to become something our communities cannot survive alongside. That story belongs to them. It still does. The cold is old, the hunger is older, and the warning has not grown less urgent with time. This legend has been told. Subscribe and return to Aeonkeep. More legends await.